Vogelzang. As part of our Smithsonian Associates Partnership Program, our guest today, Mike German, is a former special agent with the FBI where he specialized in domestic terrorism and covert operations. His undercover work against white supremacist skinhead groups and right-wing militias disrupted planned acts of terrorism against the United States and led to multiple criminal convictions. Honestly, Mike German is the real deal, and it's an eye-opening, revelatory, and timely story, given the state of the world.
And if you wanted to look at white supremacists in the United States, you'd have to try to understand that context and not assume that a white supremacist bomber in the United States is similar to a IRA bomber in Northern Ireland.
That, of course, is our guest today, Mike German. Mike will present at the Smithsonian Associates Program titled Undercover with the FBI June 27th at the Ripley Center in Washington, D.C. To survive undercover as an FBI agent, it's not enough to simply dress like a terrorist or act like a white supremacist. You have to think like them. Mike's book, Thinking Like a Terrorist, has been made into the highly acclaimed film Imperium, starring Daniel Radcliffe and Toni Collette. I'm serious. The movie gets excellent reviews, and you'll love this interview. Join me in welcoming today via Skype to the Not Old Better Show Smithsonian Associates Art of Living series, Mike German. Mike German, thanks so much for joining the show.
My pleasure.
I've done a fair bit of research on you, your career, fascinating work, and really so very interesting. I also read that you almost have this knack or this reputation for learning about what terrorists are thinking. How did you go about learning what terrorists are thinking?
Well, I was a young FBI agent, and I grew up in the 1970s, and my mother's side of the family is Irish Catholic, so that was during the period of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and because there was a familial connection, followed that conflict for some time. But joined the FBI not really thinking that terrorism was going to be something that I worked on necessarily, and in fact was assigned to work on savings and loan failure cases for the first 4 years of my career. That was in the early 1990s when savings and loan failures were in the news, and the FBI had actually ramped up and recruited people to work on savings and loan fraud. So I did that for 4 years and was ready for something new and different. And a friend of mine came over to me and said, "You have blonde hair and blue eyes. You can be a Nazi." I need an undercover agent to work on a case looking at a neo-Nazi skinhead group. So I reached out through the FBI to try to get as much information as I could, because I'm going into this very dangerous situation and wanted to be armed with as much information as I could to protect myself and to assimilate myself in this community, and was surprised to find that the FBI didn't have a lot of information about how these groups operated. So there had been some informants involved, and they had recorded some conversations, so I listened to all those recordings trying to understand as much as I could, but really what gave me the education was the people in the white supremacist movement themselves, and particularly the people who were engaged in the violence and trying to use violence as a tool to get the political changes they wanted. And what I found was they were quite educated on the topic and had all kinds of materials that they would ply me with, and that included videotapes and books and weekly newsletters that they wanted me to subscribe to, and so there turned out to be a tremendous amount of information that was available to the public. It's all published material, and in my later studies of terrorism, as that case moved into another case and continuing my FBI experience, what I found was that the terrorist groups themselves share techniques used by other groups to develop their own.
Why are there so many misunderstandings? I mean, if there's all this writing, if there's all this kind of this communication, it just seems like there's a lot of myths, there's a fair bit of misunderstanding. It even seems like law enforcement has their own level of disorganization. Bringing this kind of current, today via CNN, the headline is that Britain has suspended intelligence sharing on the Manchester bombing. So it seems like there's not even a willingness to, there was a lot of talk around 9/11 about sharing and making things, to maybe break down some of that misunderstanding, but it still exists.
Right. So I think a lot of the misunderstanding is generated because terrorism is distinguished from other violent crime by its political motives. But because it's a political crime, often the efforts taken to counter it are often highly politicized. So that once a political motive gets in between an investigator just trying to get the objective facts about what happened, you can be sure that you are going to be pushed down some wrong paths. And when I was starting in my counterterrorism career, terrorism studies was broken roughly into two schools. One that was populated mostly by psychologists who thought there must be some sort of psychological explanation that this type of violent activity directed against people who are completely innocent civilians couldn't possibly be a normal person's thinking. And what we have to do is identify what that psychological condition is or disease is so that we can treat it. And if we can't treat it, at least identify that trait in people as an investigative step to segregate them from society before they're actually able to do harm. The second school was mostly political scientists who were arguing this is really a semantic problem, that terrorism is actually just one thin slice of other kinds of political violence, and they often work in combination with one another, and it can only be understood in context with the conflict in which it occurs. So if you wanted to look at terrorism in Northern Ireland, you would have to understand that conflict and why some groups decided that the use of terrorism as a tactic was necessary or helpful to their cause. And if you wanted to look at white supremacists in the United States, you'd have to try to understand that context and not assume that a white supremacist bomber in the United States is similar to a IRA bomber in Northern Ireland. So throughout the 90s, there were a lot of experiments being done, and they would find terrorists wherever they could find them, whether these were people who had been arrested or people who had turned on their former comrades and come clean and given up their ways, or people who had just aged out, or people who had been in conflicts where the conflict was resolved. So they were now regular politicians or had gone back to whatever trade they had. But what they found was that there was very little incidence of any kind of mental illness or defect, and that in fact these were rational decisions being made, and while they weren't always pleasant, like when the government uses violence, it's not always pleasant, but could be understood as a rational act under the conditions in which they occurred. So that final recognition was probably coming to general acceptance around the time of the September 11th attack. And what happened there is, again, because there was such a politicized response, the government didn't want to have the discussion be about our policies in the Middle East and whether those were necessary or appropriate or helpful, but instead to just brand the conflict of a problem of extremist ideology and extremism that makes the conflict very simple. If your enemy is a fanatic, the only thing you can do is destroy them or incapacitate them, and that framing became what is known as radicalization, this idea. It's fascinating because it's a resurrection of the framing that was used to justify the surveillance of Martin Luther King and others in the civil rights movement and anti-war movements during the 1960s. It was the justification for suppressing the labor union organizing in the early 1900s, so it was a very old technique, but it was brought back up, and it had the benefit of the psychological approach by suggesting that this was just a problem between the ears of the terrorists and had to be addressed that way without the complexity of psychological diagnosis, right? So we're taking the science out of it, and only the people who profess this radicalization theory are the only ones who can identify it, and usually it can only be identified in hindsight. So, what we see after any of these bombings, including the latest one in Manchester, is, how did this person get radicalized, and what was their belief system, and what was their ideology, rather than focusing on the methodology and the politics behind the situation.
The term radicalization has been around a long time, and you mentioned Dr. King, and terrorism has been around for a long time. So this distinction is an interesting one. I don't know that I really ever understood it this way, but it's almost that there are different people who commit violent acts, but just because someone believes the same thing doesn't mean they're part of the conspiracy. How true is that here in America today? Seems like that's where we are.
So that's the problem, right? Is that it's very easy if you believe the ideology is the cause, then it's easy to justify surveillance of broad groups of people based on their political beliefs or religious beliefs. And that's where this radicalization model, even though the scientific studies have shown it's not accurate, the government continues to be wed to it because it justifies the mass surveillance programs they want to implement anyway. Right? So rather than acknowledging that okay, the studies suggest that ideology is not necessarily, certainly not a driver, right? There are many more people who have these ideologies, whether we're talking about neo-Nazis or Muslim extremists, who don't commit any illegal activities, much less the more rare acts of terrorism. And many of the people who actually engage in that violence, when you sit them down and you ask them about the ideology, they really only have a cursory knowledge of it. And it's more sort of a justification for what they want to do rather than any deep driver of their motivation.
Your education is really impressive, and your training is equally impressive. I know you're a former ACLU attorney. How was the transition from FBI to ACLU? I imagine learning what kind of understanding these two schools of thought. This probably gave you a fair bit of understanding in the role of your work with ACLU.
Right, and I went to law school before I joined the FBI. That was when I was coming up. That was actually one of the more direct routes into the FBI. It was getting a law degree. So I never actually practiced law. I never was licensed or anything. Went directly into the FBI and started working as an investigator. And when I left the FBI, I resigned in 2004, partly because of I was involved in a whistleblower case and was being retaliated against because I had reported management failures in a counterterrorism operation after 9/11, but also was concerned with the direction that the government was going in regards to the war on terrorism. And I knew how counterproductive many of the methodologies the government was adopting were going to be. And so when I came out, my ideas aligned well with what the ACLU was saying. So I ended up getting hired to work in their Washington legislative office, where I did lobbying on these issues.
And now your role is more. You're in a think tank, I believe. Your role is
right.
yes. And so Tell us a little bit about terrorist organizations. How are terrorists recruiting? It seems that social media is a recruiting boon to these terrorist organizations. Is that the place that you're spending time looking into these organizations and learning more about them?
So it's interesting. I think the idea that the internet and social media have created such an opportunity for any group to get their message out and to recruit is obviously true at large, right? It's easier for plumbers to find customers. It's easier for insurance salesmen to find customers, and certainly easier for anybody with any kind of political ideology, whether that's mainstream or on the extremist end of the perspective. But I think I was involved in cases with white supremacists and anti-government groups in the 1990s before most people were online, and they already had online communication set up. They had the first bulletin boards were set up in the mid-90s. This is before I had a computer on my desk as an FBI agent.
Wow.
So, the first time I heard the term email was from neo-Nazi skinhead groups in the early 90s. And what you have to understand is clandestine groups are often early adopters of new technology because they're seeking ways to communicate outside of what they believe the government will be monitoring. But it can be overstated as well, because if you look at the rates of terrorism in the United States and Western Europe, they were much higher, many more bombings and attacks in the 1970s and 80s than over the last 10 years. So to the extent there is much more communication, that doesn't necessarily result in more bombings or more terrorist attacks. So I think we have to be careful in not assuming things are true that aren't really demonstrably true. Obviously, it's a lot easier to get information around, but I was working with fairly young members of these neo-Nazi skinhead groups who all had copies of the Anarchist Cookbook and the Poor Man's James Bond and military manuals on how to create improvised explosive devices. So these materials were somehow... it's hard to remember now how we ever communicated. How did I get along as an FBI agent then when cell phones were rudimentary and didn't work in most places? And I remember when beepers were a thing, where you couldn't get a message, you just knew somebody was looking to get in touch with you. But somehow, not just FBI was able to communicate, but so were these clandestine organizations. But again, part of the way they communicated even back then was through publication. So they would publish information that went out to everyone, but there were only a few people who were really interested in looking at that stuff and could understand how it was useful. But they had all sorts of interesting communication methods. One of the things they would do is get remote messaging services. So you could, from the phone company, lease a telephone number that wasn't associated with any actual phone, but there would be messaging services associated with it. So you could say, "Hi, my name's Mike, leave a message for me." But what they would do is have a preamble that was what their group was, what they wanted to accomplish, and perhaps some information about how you could otherwise get in touch with them, and then somebody could leave a message for them that they could then pick up remotely to communicate that way. So, humans are very inventive, and particularly when they feel under pressure from government, can come up with all sorts of different ways to communicate. One of my favorite stories is one of the prosecutors involved in one of my cases in California later worked another case involving the Aryan Brotherhood, which was a California, well, actually a nationwide prison gang. He was based in Los Angeles and worked it from there, but they had been a very dangerous gang, committed a lot of murders in prison, and the leaders of the gang were all in segregation, so they had no human contact with anyone. but were still able to manage their control over the prison gang and order hits because they had developed a method of writing with invisible ink using their own urine. So
wow.
When somebody who is under that tight government control is able to communicate, it just shows how human ingenuity can't be put in a prison.
Yes, as ingenuity marches forward, as technology continues to change and develop, how do we even develop a more effective counterterrorism strategy?
So I actually think that the strategy that we used in my cases was fairly effective.
Infiltration?
Infiltration, specifically targeting specific individuals for whom there was evidence to believe they were engaged in illegal activities, and keeping the investigation as it broadened focused on people we could predicate with factual information to justify focusing on them, right? So when under the J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, there were no limitations on what the FBI could investigate, and that was part of the problem with why they came to investigate nonviolent political activists and civil rights activists and anti-war protesters. So one of the remedies was to create guidelines at the Justice Department to ensure that the FBI would focus on illegal activities by requiring a reasonable indication of criminal activity to justify an investigation. And that is a very low standard. Most FBI agents wake up pretty suspicious, so it doesn't take a lot to facts to generate a reasonable suspicion if the person is actually worthy of investigation, and that's the standard that I worked under, that I would have to sit down with a piece of paper and write out what evidence I had that made me believe this person was likely to commit a federal crime. And by using that system, I was able to keep my investigation properly focused so that I was actually using my resources, which after all are paid for by the U.S. taxpayer, in a way that was focused on actually solving a criminal problem rather than just collecting a lot of information about people who weren't doing anything wrong, who might have held beliefs that I find abhorrent, but otherwise were not. And you can imagine in a situation like I was in with neo-Nazi skinheads, pretty much everybody's saying something that horrifies me. And this is not an ideology that doesn't have historical precedent that shows how dangerous these ideas can be. But I had to have an objective fact to say this person was actually committing a federal crime. And I think those cases were successful because of that I wasn't wasting a lot of time and effort chasing people who weren't doing anything wrong and ultimately wouldn't be helpful to me as a law enforcement officer in investigating. But it also protected the civil rights of the people who weren't doing anything wrong, and it really came home to me in a trial regarding another case I had in Washington State involving anti-government militia groups, where unlike the Nazis, the militia groups had a more palatable public face. You know, they called themselves patriots. They flew American flags rather than Nazi flags. They sort of had a better PR machine working. So the trial was attended by lots of people, and it was a long trial. It was 6 weeks. And I testified, so everybody who was attending the trial knew I was the undercover agent. And there was one older gentleman who would try to recruit me. He was always handing me papers to read, much like the individuals who I met undercover. But at the end of the case, he to be clear, he didn't know the individuals. He wasn't involved in any of the criminal activity. He was just like-minded. But at the end of the trial, he walked over to me and said, "I'd like to shake your hand I want to let you know that I think you did the right thing here. I sat through the entire trial. I saw the evidence. Clearly, these people were going to hurt somebody, and that would have done damage to my movement. So I appreciate what you're doing. And that to me is effective counterterrorism. That here's somebody who was an ideological supporter of these individuals, who had a predisposition to distrust the government, and yet, because our trial system was so public and because they could see the evidence being challenged by defense attorneys and make their own decision about its validity, they could come to their own conclusion that what the government did, at least in this instant, was entirely appropriate.
Fascinating. Maybe even some behavior change that you were able to exact on that individual.
Perhaps, and I don't. My purpose was never to change anybody's minds, but if to a certain extent this person had a sense that there were agents or an agency that was looking at this objectively, and they had some piece of information that they thought needed to be in the government's hands, that they would reach out, it would be a huge step towards making everyone safer.
We are with Mike German. Mike is going to be at the Smithsonian Associates presentation June 27th. That'll be at the Ripley Center in Washington, D.C. Mike's going to be talking about being undercover with the FBI, just a fascinating subject. Mike, it's such a pleasure to talk to you. I know you're really busy. I have one final question. I want to kind of tie this back to the film Imperium. It's out now, of course. It's loosely, I suppose, your story. You may have a better way of putting that, but it's your creative effort. The stress that the level of stress that is in that film is real. I mean, I watched it almost 2 times, and I felt the stress, and I watched the character Daniel Radcliffe really exhibit that. Did the film get that right, that part of your job correct, the level of stress infiltrating and being undercover and having to use your wits to read people?
Absolutely, and that's what we were trying to capture. It's a fictional story that Daniel Ragusis, who is the director, and I wrote together, and the goal of my involvement in it was to do exactly that, to capture that what it really feels like to work undercover, the many stresses, not just the fear of discovery when you're among the bad guys, but also the bureaucratic hurdles that have to be overcome, trying to live a daily existence where you're not who you're pretending to be. So I appreciate that you feel like that was captured very well. It was fascinating work, and the agents who do it, I think, are some of the most talented people in government, and part of what we were trying to show was how it does often take that kind of individual effort, not just by the undercover agent played by Daniel Radcliffe, but the case agent as well, played by Toni Collette. And having a strong female lead, I thought, was really important because women make up only 20% of FBI agents and often have a difficult time. But in my experience, we're often some of the best investigators and truly dedicated public servants. So wanted to make sure we had a strong female lead there leading the case. And of course, part of it is too that the case agent really is a very important part of the case. That there would be no undercover agents unless there were very talented case agents putting these cases together and handling all the administrative burden and creating the operation.
Well, it's a wonderful movie, Mike, and Mike German's been with us. Mike is a former FBI agent. Mike is going to be at the Smithsonian Associates Tuesday, June 27th at the Ripley Center. Mike's written the book, Thinking Like a Terrorist. We'll put links up to where you can find the book, where you can find out more about Mike German, where you can find out a little bit more about the movie Imperium, as well as tickets, as well as information about where to get information about the tickets at Smithsonian Associates. Mike German, thanks so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure, and thanks for all your work. And this is just going to be a great presentation, so I'm looking forward to it myself.
Great. Well, I can't wait to be there and meet you in person.
Thanks, Mike. Again, my thanks to Mike German and Smithsonian Associates for arranging this show. I have to tell you, I have just been captivated by this program, this interview with Mike German. Imperium, as I say, I watched it almost twice. And the book, Thinking Like a Terrorist, I haven't read it all the way through yet, but it is excellent. I'm looking forward to meeting Mike, seeing him, joining with all of you at Smithsonian Associates for Mike German, Undercover with the FBI. And that's on June 27th, 2017 at the Ripley Center. So thanks, everybody. See you there.